The words landed on the dinner table like a knife cutting straight through my chest. "You're not half the woman your sister is," my parents said, their voices sharp, almost rehearsed, as if they had been waiting for the perfect moment to deliver the blow. The room fell silent except for the clinking of cutlery. My sister sat there with her flawless smile, soaking in the comparison like sunlight. My breath caught in my throat, and for a second I thought I might break down. But instead of tears, something colder settled in me, a calm that even I couldn't explain. People often talk about betrayal coming from friends or strangers, but no one warns you about the day your own blood decides to humiliate you. At that table, every memory of my childhood replayed in flashes, the times I stayed up to take care of my parents when they were sick, the years I sacrificed dreams to make their lives easier, the endless moments I was invisible while my sister was praised for the smallest things. I realized then that love from them had always been conditional, measured against the image of a daughter I could never be. And in that moment, I also realized something more powerful. I didn't have to keep sitting there proving myself. I didn't have to swallow their insults like bitter medicine. So I stood up calmly, my hands steady, my heart strangely light. The air in the room shifted as they looked at me, waiting for my usual silence. But I was done being quiet. That night, something inside me broke free, and nothing would ever be the same again. The dinner that night began like any other, with the usual chatter and the clinking of cutlery, but there was an edge in the air that I hadn't noticed before. My parents had been unusually quiet while my sister talked about her day at work, boasting about her achievements, the promotion she had received, the way her colleagues admired her, and how proud our parents must be. I listened, smiling politely, keeping my thoughts to myself as I had always done, because speaking up in our house often led to criticism. Then came the words I had dreaded but somehow knew were coming, delivered as casually as a simple observation. "You're not half the woman your sister is," my father said without hesitation, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to compare their children in a way that left me broken inside. My mother nodded in agreement, her eyes cold, her face emotionless, reinforcing the judgment like a final verdict in a courtroom. For a moment I froze. The cutlery stopped midair, the air in the room thickened, and the walls seemed to close in. I glanced at my sister, who sat there with that infuriatingly perfect smile, basking in their approval, seemingly oblivious to the pain they had just caused. My heart pounded, but instead of crying or shouting, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I could feel the sting of the words, but there was a clarity in that pain, a sharp awareness that this had been my life for as long as I could remember, living in the shadow of someone else, striving for love and recognition that was always conditional, never mine to claim freely. Memories of my childhood flashed before my eyes. The countless nights I had stayed up to care for my parents when they were sick, the sacrifices I had made quietly while my sister was praised for every small success, the endless attempts to follow rules I had never agreed with but had hoped would earn their admiration. Every effort had been met with a shrug or an offhand comment, while my sister's smallest achievements became trophies, celebrated loudly and endlessly. I realized then, with a painful but liberating clarity, that I had been chasing a mirage, seeking validation that would never come from them. For the first time I felt the weight of their expectations lift slightly, because in that moment I understood that their words didn't define me, and that their approval was never something I needed to survive or thrive. So I stood up, my movements deliberate, my voice calm even as it trembled inside with suppressed emotion, and I looked at them with a clarity they were unprepared for. They expected tears, begging, maybe even an apology for daring to feel hurt by their comparison. But I had none of those things to offer. Instead, I felt a sense of control, a quiet power that I had never acknowledged in myself before. My sister's smile faltered slightly, the first crack in her usual confidence, as she registered that I was no longer the silent, submissive girl she was accustomed to. I walked away from the table without a word, leaving their murmurs behind me, letting the sound of my own heartbeat drown out their judgment. In my room, I sat on the edge of my bed and let the emotions I had bottled up for years finally surge forward, not as a destructive anger, but as a recognition of my own worth, a fierce determination to no longer be measured against anyone else. I thought about all the times I had tried to compete for their attention, the countless hours I had spent shaping myself into what I thought they wanted, and I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. Grief for the love I had imagined I needed, and relief that I finally saw it for what it was. A love conditional upon comparison, never freely given, never unconditional. That night, sleep didn't come easily, not because I was troubled by the insult, but because my mind was alive with possibilities, awake in a way it hadn't been before. I considered what my life might look like if I stopped trying to be someone I wasn't, if I stopped measuring my worth by their approval, if I finally took control of my own happiness. I thought about my dreams, the ones I had put aside, the ones I had quietly abandoned because they didn't align with what my parents valued. For the first time, I felt that spark of ambition, untainted by fear of rejection or disappointment, and it was exhilarating. The following morning, I woke up with a sense of determination that surprised me. I dressed carefully, not to impress anyone but to feel strong in my own skin, and I decided to take small steps toward reclaiming my life. I started with minor acts, making decisions without seeking approval, speaking up in conversations where I would have previously remained silent, and indulging in little pleasures that were mine alone, no longer filtered through the lens of parental judgment. Each small act was a quiet rebellion, a reclaiming of autonomy that made me feel more alive than I had in years. At work, I noticed a shift in my own confidence. I no longer hesitated to share ideas, to take initiative, to demand respect where I deserved it. My colleagues, who had always seen me as competent but quiet, now noticed a new assertiveness, a presence that commanded attention without needing to compete or diminish anyone else. Even my sister noticed, though she tried to hide it, the way I had changed. It was subtle at first, my refusal to be sidelined, my unwillingness to be patronized, but she sensed that the dynamics had shifted. I felt no joy in her discomfort. Instead, I felt a quiet satisfaction that came from knowing I was finally living on my own terms. Days turned into weeks, and the initial sting of my parents' words began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of self-respect and independence. I began pursuing hobbies I had abandoned, reconnecting with friends I had neglected, and even exploring opportunities one had always considered too risky or impossible. Each success, however small, reinforced the lesson I had learned at that dinner table, that my value was inherent, not dependent on anyone's praise. I realized that the world was wider than the narrow definitions my parents had imposed on me, that life could be rich and fulfilling even if it didn't fit into their expectations. And as I walked through this new chapter of my life, I began to understand the strange power of that painful insult. It had acted as a catalyst, igniting something in me that had been dormant: courage, clarity, and a sense of purpose. I felt the old fears begin to dissolve, replaced by a quiet determination to pursue my own path, unshackled by comparison or approval. By the end of that chapter of my life, I had taken small but decisive steps toward independence. I had learned to trust my instincts, to honor my own feelings, and to recognize the subtle ways in which I had minimized myself for others. Each moment of assertion, each decision made without seeking permission, became a brick in the foundation of the person I was becoming. A person not defined by parental favoritism, by sibling rivalry, or by anyone else's standards, but by her own vision of who she wanted to be. And though I knew the journey ahead would not be easy, that old patterns and voices of judgment would inevitably resurface, I also knew I was no longer powerless. For the first time in my life I had chosen myself, and that choice, though simple, felt revolutionary. The words, "You're not half the woman your sister is," no longer wounded me. They became a mirror reflecting what I had been denying myself all along: my strength, my resilience, and my capacity to rise above judgment and comparison. That night, as I lay in bed reflecting on the events that had upended my familiar world, I felt an unfamiliar but exhilarating sensation, a sense of liberation. I realized that the real battle had never been with my sister, nor with my parents. It had been with myself, with the fear of claiming my own worth. And now that battle was finally over. The girl who had sat quietly at the dinner table, swallowing insults and shrinking herself to fit into someone else's mold, had begun to disappear, replaced by a woman who would never again measure herself against anyone else. That night, I closed my eyes not with the exhaustion of defeat, but with the thrill of possibility, ready to step into a future that was entirely mine, unbound by their expectations, and I knew that the path I was beginning to walk would lead to a life I could finally call my own. After that fateful dinner, life began to shift in ways I hadn't anticipated. At first, it was subtle, almost imperceptible. I noticed the mornings felt lighter, as if a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had lifted just a little. The act of standing up to my parents had sparked something inside me, a quiet fire that refused to be ignored. I started seeing the world differently, noticing possibilities instead of obstacles, and finding courage in places I had always overlooked. For years, I had lived in a kind of constant anticipation, waiting for approval, validation, or acknowledgement, and in the process I had silenced my own voice. Now, each day was an experiment in reclaiming it. I walked to work with my head held higher than before, noticing that people treated me differently, as though the invisible boundaries I had once let others draw around me were beginning to dissolve. I spoke more freely in meetings, contributing ideas I had once held back, and I began to see that my thoughts had value on their own, independent of the opinions of my parents or anyone else. I could feel the old, familiar tension in my chest, the part of me that expected to be dismissed, overlooked, or belittled, but this time I met it with determination instead of fear. Each small victory, each moment I chose myself over approval, strengthened me in ways I could feel in my bones. Outside of work, I made deliberate choices that reflected the new life I wanted. I reconnected with friends I had neglected, those who had always supported me quietly and without judgment, and I allowed myself to be vulnerable in ways I had long feared. I realized that I had been living in a bubble created by my family's expectations, thinking that love and acceptance only came from home, and now I was discovering that there were other places, other people, where I was seen and appreciated for who I truly was. I joined a small painting class, something I had wanted to do for years but always put off because my parents considered it frivolous. In those classes, surrounded by people laughing, sharing, and creating without fear of judgment, I felt my soul stretch and breathe for the first time in a long while. The colors on the canvas reflected emotions I hadn't allowed myself to express, and each brushstroke became a quiet rebellion against the constraints I had been living under. I realized that art was more than a hobby. It was a form of therapy, a mirror showing me who I could be when I allowed myself to exist without constantly measuring up. At home, the silence was sometimes deafening. My parents noticed the shift in me almost immediately. They tried subtle manipulation at first, dropping comments meant to guilt or provoke me into submission. "Why are you suddenly so distant?" my mother asked one evening, her voice deceptively calm. I simply smiled, refusing to be drawn into their trap. "I'm just busy," I said lightly, and I meant it. I didn't owe them an explanation. Their words, once heavy and controlling, now barely touched me. My sister, however, could not hide her unease. She had always relied on the familiar balance of favoritism to make herself feel secure, and my newfound independence was a disturbance she hadn't anticipated. She began testing me in subtle ways, making snide remarks about my choices, questioning my decisions, and even attempting to provoke anger or defensiveness. Each time I responded calmly, refusing to rise to her bait. I watched as frustration flickered in her eyes, and I realized that the power had subtly shifted. I was no longer the timid shadow she could step over without consequence. One weekend, I decided to take a trip alone to clear my mind. I booked a small cottage near the hills, far from the city, far from anyone's expectations. As I drove through winding roads surrounded by trees and mist, I felt a peace I hadn't known existed. The solitude was not loneliness. It was liberation. I spent days walking in silence, observing the world with new eyes, noticing the small miracles, the way sunlight danced on leaves, the soft murmur of a stream, the gentle hum of birds in the morning. It was as if I had discovered an entirely new dimension of life, one where I was not constantly weighed down by comparisons or judgments. At night, I sat by the fireplace in the cottage, reflecting on everything that had brought me to this point. The dinners, the insults, the endless years of feeling invisible, and I felt a strange gratitude. The pain of the past had been necessary to bring me to this awakening. I realized that I could not change my family's behavior, nor did I need to, but I could change how I responded, and in that choice lay my freedom. Returning home, I carried that sense of clarity with me. I began setting boundaries with my family, simple but firm ones, designed to protect my peace. I stopped answering calls immediately when they wanted to criticize or compare, and I refused to be drawn into arguments designed to undermine my confidence. The first few times there was tension, raised voices, and attempts to guilt me back into submission. But I stayed firm. Each time I held my ground, I felt a surge of self-respect. I was finally learning that loving myself didn't require anyone else's approval, not even the people who had once dictated the rhythm of my life. At work, my growing confidence did not go unnoticed. I began taking on projects I would have previously avoided, volunteering for responsibilities I had once considered beyond my abilities. My colleagues, many of whom had only seen me as quiet and competent but unremarkable, started treating me differently. They sought my opinion more frequently, asked for my input, and recognized my contributions openly. Each acknowledgement felt validating, not because it replaced my parents' approval, but because it reinforced the truth I was discovering. My abilities and my value were real, and they existed independently of familial validation. For the first time, I experienced the quiet thrill of self-determination, the satisfaction of progress earned through effort and persistence rather than approval seeking. During this period, I also began writing a journal every night. At first, it was simple notes about my day, but soon it evolved into reflections on my emotions, my fears, and my aspirations. Writing became a mirror for my soul, a way to process the complex mixture of relief, anger, hope, and determination that I felt. In my journal, I did not have to explain myself, justify my choices, or meet anyone's expectations. I was allowed to be entirely and unapologetically me. Reading back through my entries over time, I could see the transformation taking shape. The timid, insecure girl who had once trembled at her parents' words was gradually being replaced by someone strong, self-assured, and determined. It was a slow process, but each word written, each reflection examined, solidified my independence. One evening, my sister confronted me directly. She had come over unannounced, her tone sharp and controlled, trying to provoke the old me, the one who would cower under scrutiny. "Why are you acting so different?" she demanded. "It's like you're trying to prove something." I looked at her calmly, a small, knowing smile forming on my lips. "I'm not trying to prove anything to anyone," I replied simply. "I'm just living my life." Her eyes narrowed, searching for the hint of insecurity or fear that had always been present. When she didn't find it, frustration flickered across her face. I realized then that her confidence had always been built on comparison, on the fragile notion that I was weaker or less deserving. Without that dynamic, she felt unsteady. I felt no joy in her discomfort, only a quiet recognition of how much power I had quietly reclaimed for myself. As the weeks passed, I found joy in small, ordinary moments. I learned to cook meals I loved without worrying about pleasing anyone else, took walks just to feel the wind on my face, and even danced alone in my room without self-consciousness. I began volunteering at a local community center, helping women who struggled with confidence or abusive relationships, offering them the support I had long wished I had. Each smile, each moment of gratitude from someone I helped, reinforced the understanding that I could create impact and meaning in ways that had nothing to do with my family's approval. Evenings at home were no longer tense or oppressive. I occasionally visited my parents, but now the visits were brief, polite, and carefully managed. I no longer allowed their words to dominate my emotions or dictate my sense of self. My sister still tried to undermine me occasionally, but I was prepared. I had learned that my peace was more valuable than proving a point. In moments when they attempted to guilt or belittle, I simply excused myself, walked away, or redirected the conversation, feeling no need to explain myself. Each interaction became a practice in self-respect, a test of my commitment to the independence I had fought so hard to claim. By the end of the chapter, I began to see a larger picture of my life. I realized that the world outside my family's judgment was full of possibilities, friendships, experiences, and successes waiting to be discovered. I had been living in a cage made of comparisons, favoritism, and expectation, and now that cage was gone. The path ahead was not without challenges, and I knew that my old fears and insecurities would resurface at times, but I also knew I had developed the strength to face them. I was no longer defined by their approval or criticism. I was defined by my choices, my actions, and my courage to stand for myself. That chapter of my life ended not with confrontation or triumph over others, but with a quiet, profound victory. The discovery that my worth had never been tied to anyone else's opinion, and the understanding that the life I wanted was mine to claim. And for the first time I felt ready to embrace that life fully, step by step, moment by moment, with confidence and purpose. By the time the third chapter of my life began, I had learned to appreciate the quiet strength that came with independence. Each day felt like a small victory, a confirmation that I was capable of shaping my own life without leaning on anyone else's approval. Work had become not just a place of responsibility but a stage where I could measure my own growth. I started taking initiatives that had once terrified me, the presentations, the projects, even negotiations that required me to assert my opinion firmly. First, my colleagues looked surprised. They had always known me as polite, diligent, and reserved, someone who quietly fulfilled her duties without seeking the spotlight. But now they began to see me as someone different. Someone confident, deliberate, and unafraid to claim space. Even the small compliments I received from peers, people who had never cared about my home life or my family's criticisms, felt more real than any praise I had sought from my parents. It was validation, not because it replaced the love I had wanted, but because it came without expectation, without comparison, without judgment. I began to understand that recognition earned through effort, authenticity, and persistence carried a satisfaction that could never be replicated by familial approval. That realization alone gave me a kind of joy I had never experienced before, a deep, calm, and steady satisfaction that seemed to settle into my bones. Outside work, life unfolded in a rhythm that belonged to me alone. I continued attending my painting classes, but now I experimented more boldly with colors, strokes, and abstract ideas. I allowed myself to fail, to make mistakes, to create art that was messy and imperfect, and I loved it. Each painting became a reflection of my emotions, a diary in color and texture, showing the world who I was without requiring words. I also started volunteering more regularly at the community center, helping women who were struggling with self-confidence, abusive relationships, or feeling trapped in situations they believed they couldn't escape. Their gratitude was not just rewarding, it was transformative. I realized that every woman I encouraged, every life I touched, was a mirror of my own journey. I was helping others reclaim the strength I had fought so hard to find within myself. In teaching them to see their own value, I reinforced my own. It was a cycle of empowerment, one that I had never imagined possible when I had felt trapped by my parents' comparisons and favoritism. The dynamics at home, however, were slowly beginning to shift in subtle but noticeable ways. My parents, perhaps unsettled by my growing independence, started to pay attention to my actions, though they rarely commented directly. When they did, it was always wrapped in the same condescending tone, but now it barely affected me. I learned to listen without internalizing their judgment. My sister, however, was a different story. She could no longer rely on the same hierarchy that had long protected her ego. She tried to provoke arguments, test my patience, and even belittle my choices, but I met each attempt with calm and composure. Sometimes she would make a pointed remark about my art or volunteer work, asking if I was trying to show her up. I would simply smile and continue speaking about what I enjoyed, refusing to let her frame the narrative. Her frustration was palpable, and I realized that for the first time our relationship was being recalibrated. I no longer existed as her shadow. Instead, I had begun to occupy my own space, with a presence that was undeniable and unapologetic. One afternoon, I received an unexpected opportunity that tested my newfound confidence. A local gallery had noticed my paintings from the community center exhibits and invited me to showcase my work in a small exhibition. Initially, a part of me hesitated, the old voice in my head whispering doubts about whether I was good enough, or if anyone would take me seriously. But I recognized that voice for what it was. Fear, not truth. I accepted the invitation, feeling a thrill of anticipation mixed with a strange, nervous energy. Preparing for the exhibition became a journey in itself. I selected pieces that were bold, experimental, and deeply personal, pieces that reflected not just skill but vulnerability, growth, and self-expression. Each choice reminded me that I had spent too long hiding in shadows and that now it was time to be seen. On the night of the exhibition, as I walked through the gallery observing visitors engage with my work, I felt an overwhelming sense of pride. People asked questions, complimented my technique, and even shared how the paintings resonated with their own experiences. That feeling, the quiet recognition of my talent and effort, was far more powerful than any praise I had received at home or in comparison to my sister. It reinforced the lesson I had been learning. True value is not measured by others' approval but by authenticity, effort, and courage. Around the same time, a new friendship began to grow into something more meaningful. A colleague named Amir, who had been quietly supportive and kind, started spending time with me outside work. Unlike my family, he didn't compare, criticize, or judge. He simply appreciated me as I was. Our conversations flowed easily, filled with laughter, mutual respect, and shared curiosity about life. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to be vulnerable without fear of manipulation or judgment. I discovered that relationships could exist without hierarchy or comparison, and that companionship could nurture rather than restrict. This realization was profoundly liberating. I began to see that the love I had longed for from my parents could manifest in other forms, and that genuine connection was built on mutual respect, not expectation. Despite the growth and freedom I was experiencing, occasional moments of reflection reminded me of how deep the past wounds ran. Sometimes late at night, I would catch myself replaying my parents' words, the sting of their comparisons, and the hurt caused by their favoritism. But rather than weakening me, those memories became evidence of how far I had come. I could feel the contrast sharply. The old me, timid, afraid, and dependent on validation, versus the new me, confident, self-assured, and grounded in her own value. Those moments of reflection were no longer painful. They were markers of resilience, reminders that I had survived years of emotional neglect and comparison, and that I was stronger because of it. One evening, my sister confronted me again, this time in a more vulnerable way. She had recently faced criticism at her job and came to me, perhaps unconsciously seeking reassurance or guidance. I noticed the tension in her voice, the uncertainty in her eyes. For the first time, I felt a mixture of empathy and curiosity rather than resentment. I listened calmly, offering advice and encouragement without judgment. In that moment, I realized something powerful. My growth had created a space where I could engage with my sister without fear, without competition, without the need to assert dominance or superiority. I could interact from a place of confidence and kindness, and it was liberating. I understood that my independence didn't require hostility. It allowed room for compassion, even toward someone who had once been my source of pain. Around the same period, I began setting more concrete goals for my future. I explored further opportunities in art, considering workshops, collaborations, and even potential teaching. I thought about traveling to learn from other artists, immersing myself in creative communities, and expanding the world I had begun to build for myself. These ambitions, which once seemed impossible or frivolous in the eyes of my parents, now felt attainable. The thought of pursuing them filled me with energy rather than fear. For the first time, I felt the thrill of possibility that had always been denied by comparison and judgment. As the months progressed, the subtle shifts in family dynamics became more pronounced. My parents began to acknowledge my presence in indirect ways, noticing achievements without openly praising them, and my sister, though still competitive, had begun to adjust to my independence. While old patterns occasionally resurfaced, I had developed strategies to maintain boundaries, protect my peace, and assert my autonomy. I realized that independence was not a destination but a practice, a series of daily choices to honor myself, my goals, and my worth. Each decision reinforced the growing foundation of strength and clarity that had been building since that night at the dinner table. By the end of this chapter, I had come to understand that life's value was not in comparison, criticism, or favoritism, but in the courage to claim your own space and live authentically. I had transformed my fear into determination, my anger into motivation, and my grief into growth. The girl who once sat silently, absorbing judgment and fading into shadows, was now evolving into someone bold, resilient, and unapologetically alive. Each brushstroke, each act of independence, each step toward self-fulfillment became a testament to the strength I had discovered within myself. And though the journey ahead remained uncertain, I felt ready, armed not just with ambition, but with the clarity and courage to define my life on my own terms, unshackled from the weight of expectation or comparison. For the first time, I truly believed that I could create a life that was fully my own, one decision, one choice, one brave step at a time. By the time I reached this stage of my journey, I had grown used to the feeling of standing firmly on my own 2 feet, though life had a way of testing my resilience in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. Work had become both a sanctuary and a proving ground, a place where I could measure my growth and push my boundaries. I started taking on responsibilities that challenged me creatively and professionally, volunteering for tasks that I once would have avoided out of fear of failure or judgment. Every challenge I faced became a reflection of how far I had come since that night at the dinner table. I realized that the person I was becoming wasn't someone fragile or dependent. She was someone who could navigate difficulties with patience, calm, and determination. Even moments that used to fill me with anxiety, like public speaking or difficult conversations with colleagues, now became opportunities to practice assertiveness and grace. Each success, no matter how small, reinforced my sense of self-worth and reminded me that the approval I had spent so many years chasing was not necessary to define who I was. I had begun to trust myself in a way I had never done before, understanding that my instincts, decisions, and efforts were enough. Outside of work, my life had blossomed in ways that surprised me. I continued to dedicate time to my painting, exploring new techniques and experimenting with styles I had once feared to try. I discovered a boldness in my creativity that mirrored the courage I had found in my daily life. My pieces became more expressive, more personal, reflecting emotions I had long suppressed in an attempt to conform to expectations. Each painting felt like a declaration of independence, a visual testament to the freedom I was claiming for myself. Alongside art, my volunteer work deepened. Helping women find their own voices and reclaim their strength became a passion, a way to channel my experiences into something meaningful. I saw myself in their struggles, in the moments of doubt and fear, and it made my work profoundly personal. Every success I witnessed in the women I mentored became a reflection of my own journey, a reminder that resilience and self-respect were not only attainable but contagious. Through these interactions, I realized that empowerment was not just about achieving goals but about inspiring others to see their own worth. The relationship with my sister continued to evolve, though it was often complicated. She oscillated between irritation and reluctant admiration, struggling to reconcile the image of me she had long dismissed with the reality of my independence. Our conversations, once fraught with tension and silent competition, began to take on new dimensions. She started asking for advice on matters she had previously handled with confidence, revealing cracks in her carefully maintained facade. I approached her with patience and empathy, understanding that her own insecurities were driving much of the behavior I had endured. I had learned that responding with anger or defensiveness only perpetuated old patterns. Instead, I chose calm, measured words, asserting my boundaries while offering guidance when appropriate. The shift was subtle, but undeniable. I felt a strange sense of peace in our interactions, knowing that I could maintain my integrity and autonomy while still engaging with her. This balance was delicate, yet it became a testament to the strength I had cultivated. Strength not born from confrontation, but from self-awareness and self-respect. During this period, an unexpected opportunity presented itself that would challenge me in new ways. A regional art competition was announced, open to both emerging and established artists. Initially, I hesitated, feeling the old familiar doubts creep in, the fear of failure, the thought that I was not good enough, the voice in my head warning me of judgment. But as I considered it, I recognized those fears as remnants of my past, echoes of the limitations I had been conditioned to accept. I decided to participate, determined to face the challenge head-on. The process of preparing for the competition was intense. I spent countless hours creating, refining, and perfecting my pieces, pouring not only technical skill but emotion and experience into every brushstroke. Each painting was a reflection of my journey, a visual narrative of struggle, growth, and liberation. The work was exhausting at times, both physically and emotionally, yet it was also exhilarating. I felt alive in a way that I had rarely experienced, fully engaged in a pursuit that mattered deeply to me, independent of anyone's approval or judgment. As the day of the competition approached, nerves and anticipation mingled in my chest. I reminded myself repeatedly that the outcome did not define me. The act of creating and participating was itself a victory. When the exhibition opened, I wandered among the displays, observing other artists' work with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. I noticed visitors stopping to examine my pieces, asking questions and complimenting my technique. Each interaction reinforced the lesson I had been learning over the past months, that recognition and appreciation were meaningful when they came from genuine engagement, not from obligation or comparison. When the winners were announced, I did not place first, but I did not feel disappointment. The joy I experienced in creating, sharing, and connecting with others was far greater than any external accolade could provide. For the first time, I understood that achievement was not only about prizes or validation, but about embracing the process and trusting in one's own journey. During this time, my personal life continued to flourish in quiet but significant ways. My friendship with Amir deepened, and we began sharing our aspirations, fears, and experiences more openly. I discovered that trust and companionship could be profoundly healing, especially when rooted in mutual respect and understanding. Our conversations often drifted late into the night, filled with laughter, honesty, and support. Through our connection, I learned that intimacy and partnership were not about dependence but about complementing each other's strengths, respecting boundaries, and encouraging growth. This understanding of relationships was transformative, offering me a perspective I had never gained from my family, a perspective rooted in equality, empathy, and trust. Even as my life grew richer and more fulfilling, occasional moments of reflection reminded me of how deeply my past had shaped me. At times, memories of my parents' criticism, my sister's competitive remarks, and the years I had spent seeking approval resurfaced unexpectedly. However, these reflections no longer paralyzed me. They became points of reference, markers of resilience, and reminders of the journey I had undertaken. I could acknowledge the pain without letting it dominate my present. Each memory reinforced the contrast between the life I had endured and the life I was actively creating. It was a lesson in perspective. The past had shaped me, but it did not define me. I had the power to choose my path, cultivate my happiness, and honor my worth independently of anyone else's opinion. Family interactions became increasingly nuanced. My parents, while still capable of criticism, began to realize that their previous attempts to control or manipulate my emotions no longer worked. I noticed subtle shifts in their behavior, hesitation in their words, more measured tones, and occasional attempts to engage positively. While I did not expect full acknowledgement or praise, the changes signaled that my independence was altering the dynamic in ways they had not anticipated. My sister, too, adjusted to my newfound strength, learning that the old tactics of comparison and provocation no longer held sway. Our relationship became a study in negotiation and balance, a mixture of understanding, tension, and reluctant respect. I realized that independence was not only about asserting boundaries but also about navigating complex relationships without losing oneself. As this chapter progressed, I began envisioning the future with clarity and confidence. I considered further opportunities in art, contemplating exhibitions, teaching, and collaborations with other artists. I thought about travel, exploration, and the possibility of immersing myself in creative communities that would nurture both personal and professional growth. These aspirations, once dismissed as unrealistic or secondary, now felt tangible and attainable. I recognized that the courage I had cultivated through years of emotional struggle had equipped me to pursue dreams that once seemed impossible. I felt a sense of excitement and possibility that was both energizing and empowering. By the end of this chapter, I had come to understand that true strength was a combination of resilience, self-respect, and the willingness to embrace vulnerability. I had learned that independence was not simply about physical separation or emotional distance. It was about cultivating a life guided by one's values, passions, and authenticity. Each choice I made, each step I took, reinforced the realization that my life belonged to me alone. I no longer measured my worth against others, nor did I allow past judgments to dictate my actions. I had discovered the quiet power of self-determination, a strength that grew from understanding, patience, and courage. The girl who had once sat silently at the dinner table, absorbing criticism and comparison, had been replaced by a woman who could navigate the world with confidence, creativity, and compassion. Though the journey was ongoing, I had reached a point where I felt capable of facing the challenges ahead, knowing that my foundation was built not on the shifting sands of others' approval, but on the solid ground of my own conviction and self-respect. The future, once uncertain and intimidating, now stretched before me as a canvas waiting to be filled with the colors of my choosing, reflecting the life I had fought to claim. Fully, authentically, and unapologetically to be why the time I reached this final chapter of my journey, I had grown into a version of myself I barely recognized from the timid girl who once sat silently at the dinner table, swallowing insults and comparisons. Life had taught me lessons I could never have learned if I had remained compliant or dependent. And now I felt a clarity and confidence that touched every part of my life. My work had flourished beyond what I imagined, and my creative pursuits had opened doors I had never dared to knock on before. Exhibitions, collaborations, and opportunities to teach and mentor other aspiring artists had become part of my world, each one a reminder that pursuing my passions with authenticity and dedication could bring tangible rewards, not just in recognition but in fulfillment. Every brushstroke, every conversation, every small risk I had taken was evidence that I was capable of building a life on my own terms, a life defined by courage, effort, and self-respect rather than by anyone else's measure of worth. With each passing day, I felt more at peace with myself, more grounded in my own value, and more certain that the journey I had undertaken, though painful at times, was worth every struggle. My relationship with my family had shifted in ways I hadn't anticipated. My parents, who had once wielded comparison and criticism like weapons, now treated me with a cautious respect. They noticed my accomplishments, my independence, and my happiness, though they rarely expressed it directly. I had learned that I did not need their explicit praise to validate my existence. Their silence or begrudging acknowledgement no longer carried the power to shape my self-worth. My sister, too, had changed. The dynamic between us had grown more balanced, less about competition and more about understanding and occasional collaboration. She began to recognize my choices and achievements without needing to diminish me in the process. And though our relationship was not perfect, it was healthier, less fraught with tension, and more based on mutual acknowledgement. I realized that part of growing independent was not about cutting ties or seeking revenge. It was about transforming relationships by asserting boundaries, modeling strength, and maintaining compassion even when it was difficult. I could love and respect my family without allowing their past behavior to control me, and that understanding was liberating. As I reflected on my journey, I realized that the most profound change had occurred internally. I had cultivated a quiet resilience, a sense of self that was unwavering even in the face of challenges or criticism. I no longer feared judgment, comparison, or rejection, because I understood that my worth was inherent and not contingent on anyone's approval. This inner strength became the lens through which I navigated all aspects of life, from friendships to professional decisions to creative endeavors. I approached new situations with curiosity and courage, unafraid to make mistakes, and willing to learn from every experience. I discovered the joy of living deliberately, making choices that aligned with my values and desires rather than those imposed by others. Each success and each setback became a lesson, a step forward, a marker of progress in a life increasingly defined by authenticity. Love and connection became integral to my growth. My relationship with Amir had deepened into a partnership built on mutual respect, support, and understanding. Unlike the conditional love I had known from my family, our bond was reciprocal and empowering. We shared dreams, fears, and daily experiences without the need for competition or validation. In him, I discovered that intimacy could be freeing rather than confining, nurturing rather than restricting. The experience taught me that relationships, like life itself, required boundaries, honesty, and mutual encouragement, and that true connection did not demand the sacrifice of self-respect. Our companionship became a reminder that love could be an empowering force, not a measure of dependence or approval. In my professional life, new opportunities continued to expand my horizons. I began teaching workshops for young artists, guiding them not only in technique but in discovering their unique voice. Watching them grow, develop confidence, and express themselves freely was a profound reminder of the journey I had undertaken. Each student's success became a reflection of my own resilience and growth. I realized that my path was not just about personal achievement, but about contributing to the world in a way that inspired and empowered others. This realization reinforced the understanding that true fulfillment comes not only from self-discovery but from sharing that knowledge and strength with others. It was a cycle of empowerment that I had never imagined possible when I felt trapped by my parents' comparisons and my sister's shadow. Even in moments of solitude, I felt content. I spent evenings painting, writing in my journal, or walking in nature, savoring the quiet victories of a life lived authentically. I reflected on the past not with regret but with gratitude for the lessons it had imparted. The pain of my parents' favoritism, the sting of comparison, and the years of feeling unseen had all contributed to the strength, clarity, and self-respect I now possessed. I understood that adversity, when met with courage and reflection, could become a catalyst for transformation. I had learned to embrace vulnerability, acknowledge my emotions, and allow them to guide me rather than control me. This inner work became the foundation upon which all other achievements rested, a source of resilience and peace that no external force could undermine. One afternoon, a moment arrived that symbolized the full circle of my journey. My parents invited me over for a casual family gathering, something that had always been tense in the past. I approached it with calm and preparation, knowing that their words no longer had the power to define me. During the conversation, my father, perhaps unknowingly, complimented an artwork I had recently displayed, and my mother acknowledged the community work I had undertaken. I smiled, accepting their words with grace, not because I needed them to validate my achievements, but because I recognized their intention and allowed myself to enjoy the interaction without fear or insecurity. My sister, sitting nearby, watched me with something like respect in her eyes, though she tried to disguise it. In that moment, I realized how far I had come, from a girl shrinking in shadows to a woman standing fully in her own light. The family dynamic had shifted, not because they had changed completely, but because I had changed, and my independence had subtly altered the way we interacted. I had learned that empowerment was not about demanding recognition, but about cultivating strength, boundaries, and authenticity that others could not ignore. That evening, after returning home, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The memories of painful dinners, comparisons, and dismissals were still there, but they no longer held the same power over me. I understood that those experiences had been necessary to shape the person I had become. They had forced me to confront fear, doubt, and inadequacy, and in facing them, I had discovered resilience, self-respect, and clarity. I felt a sense of closure, not as an endpoint, but as a confirmation that I had the tools and strength to navigate life on my own terms. The journey had transformed not only my circumstances but my understanding of myself, my relationships, and the world around me. In the final months of this chapter, I began planning for the future with a sense of excitement and possibility I had never known. I envisioned new artistic projects, travel, and the expansion of my community work. I saw myself taking bold steps, embracing opportunities without hesitation, and continuing to grow both personally and professionally. The fears that once held me back, the fear of judgment, failure, or comparison, were no longer anchors but reminders of how far I had come. I felt empowered to embrace challenges, pursue dreams, and build a life aligned with my values and desires. Each day was an affirmation of the life I had chosen, a life not defined by the limitations imposed by others, but by the choices, courage, and authenticity that I brought to every moment. As I looked back one final time on the years of struggle, silence, and comparison, I realized that the journey had been far more than a personal battle. It had been a process of transformation, empowerment, and awakening. I had learned that independence was not merely the absence of external control, but the presence of self-respect, courage, and clarity. I had discovered that true strength was rooted in authenticity, patience, and resilience, and that meaningful relationships were built on trust, empathy, and mutual encouragement rather than control or approval. I had transformed pain into purpose, struggle into growth, and doubt into determination. The girl who once trembled under the weight of judgment had become a woman capable of navigating life with grace, courage, and self-assurance. Finally, I understood that the story that began with hurtful words and comparison had led me to a place of profound freedom. I had claimed my voice, my identity, and my life. I had learned to love myself fiercely, to pursue my passions boldly, and to cultivate relationships that nurtured rather than diminished me. The shadows of the past no longer dictated my present, and the future was a canvas of infinite possibilities. I had emerged from the pain stronger, wiser, and more alive than I had ever imagined. The journey had not been easy, but it had been necessary, and it had brought me to a place of unshakable confidence, joy, and purpose. In the quiet of my home, surrounded by my paintings, my journal, and the life I had built, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction and peace. I was no longer defined by anyone else's standards or comparisons. I was whole, independent, and free. I had chosen myself, and in doing so, I had finally discovered the life I was always meant to live. Enjoyed the story? Like, share, and comment your thoughts. Subscribe to Twisted Fate Chronicle for more thrilling tales every week.